Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Life, Love, and Spirituality. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today's video is going to be called, Where Was God? In recent videos, I've talked about the enormous fears that I developed as a result of growing up in Brooklyn, New York, and bad things that had happened there, as well as a fear of death that I experienced because death came early in my life and I saw the experience of and trauma of grief. And so today I'm going to talk about how a lot of that changed once I became a God follower nearly 50 years ago. I went to God right after I came to know Him in a personal way. And I felt like since I knew my heart was contrite and humble, I knew I could ask Him the question, where were you, God, during any number of experiences that were so damaging and traumatic to me? I honestly believe that most people don't come to God or don't trust God because of the age-old question, if God is loving, then why does He allow suffering? Why does He allow bad things in my life? That will be a video for another day, but it's an important question and one that each of us really need to resolve in our own hearts. And so I went to God and I began to think of some of the most traumatic things that had happened to me. One of which happened when I was an 11-year-old girl and my grandmother Ann died. I loved my grandmother Ann desperately. And the worst part of the day of her funeral was the fact that when we went back to our apartment after the funeral, we had been robbed. Our apartment was completely ransacked, papers, clothing all over the floor, and our poor cat had been traumatized and thrown into the bathroom where she had thrown up. It still makes me sick today to think about that. So I had to ask God, where were you when that happened to me? My grandmother Ann was a kindred spirit with me. She was an old soul. The apartment she shared with my grandfather in Brooklyn was something like out of a museum. They had beautiful wood furniture, and I still remember in her bedroom, her dresser being lined with beautiful perfume bottles, with wonderful scents and smells and powders galore. I remember how much that appealed to me compared to my own apartment that my parents had, which had a yellow couch and an orange oversized chair. Way too modern for my taste, for sure. And my grandmother baked. She was the only one in my family who was a baker, because I was told that that's why there are bakeries, because most Jewish people just don't bake. But my grandmother was the exception. She would bake these chocolate chip cookies. I can still smell them and almost taste them today. They're ooey gooey goodness. And she would line a men's shirt box with wax paper, and she would layer her cookies into those for us to take home. While all of that may sound idyllic, in fact, the problem was that my grandfather and my grandmother argued incessantly. A cousin told me that my grandfather had actually been the first Jewish student admitted to NYU Medical School. I couldn't believe it because that is not the grandfather I knew. My grandfather that I knew was a cold, hardened, unhappy man. Later I found out that he had to drop out of medical school because he didn't have the money to stay in. So he dropped out, he drove a cab for the rest of his life, and he developed a horrible gambling addiction, which led, in fact, to no money in their household, which was the source of all of their fights. In fact, when we would visit, My father then would get involved in those arguments. We would leave with dismay and anguish. My grandmother Ann crying terribly, and all of us feeling horrible, while my mother and father argued the entire way home. I couldn't help but think, is this how all people live? So my grandmother got sick and she was admitted to the hospital. And I still remember vividly standing on this sidewalk outside the hospital and my parents pointing up to the window where my grandmother Ann was. They wouldn't let me go see her. They said I was too young and that someday I would understand. I was so angry, as if looking at her window might somehow make it all right for me. I wanted nothing more than to pull out of their hands, rush the door, hit the elevator, and go to see her one last time for a tear-drenched kiss from her beautiful face. And yet it never, ever happened. So my grandmother passed away. Tragically, my mother said, and I'll never forget, your grandmother Ann died of a broken heart. And that always stuck with me. And so we planned, obviously, a funeral service for my grandmother. It took place in the synagogue. And after the synagogue service, we were all to go to the cemetery. And I just could not bear the thought of seeing the coffin buried into the deep, cold, hard ground. It was almost too much for me to bear. And so I begged my parents, can I please just go back to our apartment? And then my Nana, my other grandmother, and my brother would join us later after the service at the cemetery. They finally relented. A very good friend of our family drove me home. And when we got to the front of the apartment building, she said, Debbie, she said, you don't want to spend all day by yourself. Why don't you just come home with me? And I thought, no, I'm fine. I was a very independent preteen at that point, and I thought I would just be fine. She then said, Debbie, I'll make you spaghetti and meatballs. Well, she knew those were music to my ears. Those words were music to my ears. Because my mother worked, we hardly ever had home-cooked meals. And spaghetti and meatballs were like my favorite. And she had a daughter my age who would be home from school that I could hang around with. So off I went to their apartment, enjoyed our dinner. Then they drove us home. My Nana and my brother at that point had joined us. We walked in, and my Nana, in her very curt way, said, don't you people ever clean up? And we couldn't imagine what on earth she was talking about. Well, we walked in, and as I said, our apartment had been ransacked. Adding insult to injury, thieves read obituaries, the police told us, and they know exactly when the apartment will be vacant for them to come in and rob. And it was just horrible. The entire experience was horrible. So I said to God, where were you during that time and during that awful day of my life? And I could literally sense the Spirit of God in a very hushed tone say, Debbie, I was in the spaghetti and meatballs. I knew exactly what he meant. Had I gone back into my apartment when the thieves were there, who knows what might have happened to me. So with that story and feeling good about God's answer, I proceeded to another experience. This one happened in the summer between my sophomore and my junior year of college. I had driven some friends to Greenwich Village, and we went to a coffee shop. It was crowded, and we were sitting down enjoying our, coffee and our pastries. And all of a sudden, I literally felt something sliding across my back. I knew it wasn't the crowd. I instinctively knew as I looked up and saw two huge, very large men out the door. One was pushing the other man from behind. The other man had a raincoat over his shoulder, and the other man was pushing him from behind. I could literally tell that my purse was underneath that raincoat. And so without hesitation and taking obviously great risk to my life, I just impulsively took off after them. We ran several blocks until they finally stopped at an old brown Buick. And I went on the passenger side of the car and I begged the man, please, I just want my keys. I just want my keys. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. Eventually, he pushed me far enough away that he could slam that two-door, that old Buick door, and off they went. Incredibly, when I looked up from there I was in the street, there was a circle of people watching me. No one called the police. No one tried to help. Finally, when my friends caught up with me and found me, I literally had to borrow a dime. There was no cell phones back in those days, and I needed a dime to call my parents. Now, what you have to understand is that the weekend before, I had taken my parents' car, and we only had one car. I had taken my parents' car to Long Island, where I had too much to drink. I lost my keys on the beach, and I had to call my parents to find a ride to come out and rescue me. So here, the following weekend, I was in that exact same situation again. So you can imagine why I did not want to have to call my parents, but I did. They found their way out to me, and naturally I received a very deserved lecture all the way home. Thank God the thieves did not rummage and take my keys and then find my car and steal it. That was like one good thing for that experience. However, a very strange thing happened. A few weeks later, I checked my mail at the apartment, and there was this little soft package for me. I opened it up, and there was my purse. It was a denim, very soft purse that could just be, put into this package. In that purse was all my belongings, except the $12 in the wallet that they took, which of course I didn't care about. But strangely enough, there were two other things in the package that didn't belong to me. One was a mirror, and on the back of the mirror, a small compact mirror, and on the back of the mirror was a picture of Jesus overlooking the city of Jerusalem. Now, I didn't know anything about Jesus at that time, but I could certainly recognize him in that, on that mirror. The other thing was a little small address book. And I kind of figured that the person who owned the address book was the same person whose mirror it was. And I was tempted to call her or him and let them know, but I didn't. I just threw them away and didn't really think about it after that. However, during my session with God, he reminded me. He said, Debbie, I was trying to get your attention even then. And so I, realized that here God had been pursuing me, even when I didn't know who he was. And finally, my last story involves that same summer, which is when the son of Sam, the notorious killer, murderer of teenage young adult women, was all throughout the streets murdering women my age with long brown hair. He would go up to a car with a woman in it or see a woman walking. He would take out his .44 revolver and he would shoot her dead. I remember sitting in the car of a friend of mine. We had gone out that night, and we were parked right in front of my apartment building, and we were saying goodnight. Very slowly, I heard a car pull up next to me. I was convinced that if I turned around, I would see the barrel of that gun, and it would be the son of Sam, and I would be his next victim. Well, it wasn't. It was a police officer, and the reason he stopped was because he said, you need to get inside your building and your apartment because the son of Sam is loose, and you don't want to be anywhere where he could be, and you could be in danger. Incredibly, I found out that he had indeed murdered a woman that night. And I later found out multiple other places where he had been, I had also been at those places when murders took place. It was such a scary time, and this is funny. The New York Police Department could not apprehend him. So what did they do? They called upon the mafia, the New York mafia, to locate the son of Sam. That happened. He was arrested and obviously sentenced to life in prison. Incredibly, years later, I read that the son of Sam actually gave his heart and his life to God. I totally believe it because he has never once sought parole. He takes total responsibility for the murders he committed and is living the rest of his life out in prison. So you can see that all of these things, the way that God was pursuing me. And I have to tell you, I'm nothing special. I share these stories because God loves you and is pursuing you the way he was pursuing me, even if you don't know it. My favorite Bible verse is Psalm 23, the very famous Psalm of David. And the last verse says, surely goodness and mercy, and the word mercy there is chesed, the Hebrew word for everlasting mercy, everlasting kindness, God's goodness, his favor towards you is pursuing me all the days of my life. I would encourage you, therefore, ask God. Don't be afraid. I didn't know he was pursuing me all that time. He wants to know and love you more than you want to be known and loved. He wants to heal and redeem every single hurt and trauma in your life. He has the power and the desire to do so. So please ask him. Please seek him. You will not be disappointed. I hope that you've enjoyed this YouTube video. I hope you'll check out others on my website, and I hope that you will experience the chesed of God until we chat again, his everlasting mercy and love in your life.